The Indian Mutiny and Great Uprising between 1857 and 1858 was for generations known as the Sepoy Rebellion, after the Persian word for soldier, sipahi. A feature of British imperial history textbooks and imperial lore, the uprisings of thousands of Indian soldiers was the single greatest threat to British rule since the Battle of Plassey in 1757. But the uprising was more than simply a military mutiny, nor was it a pure nationalist uprising. The sources of alienation, as we've seen, can be best understood against the background of massive social change in India after the 1820s and up through the 1850s. The events of 1857 were far more complex, layered, and colored by caste, class, and region than simple labels might imply. Today, we're going to cover three major themes. First, we're going to see how the grievances accumulated in India against the company since the 1820s, and how the company's voracious fiscal appetite often fueled these grievances. Second, we'll examine the outbreak, scope, and progress of the uprising. And third, and lastly, we'll see what changed after the mutiny and how the experience of the uprising changed the way Britain governed India as a colony. After today, we'll have a better understanding of the uprising and see how it should be seen not as so much as an inevitable outcome of the way the company ruled India, with its fiscal obligations impeding its political responsibilities as a political sovereign in India. Now, let's start with the accumulating resentment being felt. First, there were the religious and cultural ones. The period of liberal reform by British officials, missionaries, and observers had critiqued India like never before. Indians of many stripes started to resent British meddling in their religious, cultural, and social matters. But the religious grievances were the most pronounced. The steady stream of missionaries after the 1810s theologically assaulted Hinduism and Islam to an unprecedented degree. Many Indians, including the Sipahis who served the company, felt honestly that their religions were under attack. And it didn't help that some British officers were largely sympathetic with evangelical Christianity. Some of them even allowed missionaries to preach openly in the barracks. And since their methods were confrontational and indeed polemical, many Indian soldiers felt, hey, not only is our country being changed, but the British want to make us Christian. Or as was sometimes said, quote, the company has plundered our lands, and now they want to plunder our souls. Since this was happening at a high point of British imperial and global power, the British were slow to understand this reaction, and they were often blinded by their own arrogance. There were also economic grievances that Indians had. The continual shoring up of debts affected Indian soldiers. To cut costs, high caste Sipahis saw their bonuses, or batas, cut. The company's military and political ambitions were always greater than their fiscal resources, and loyal Indian soldiers were now being asked to foot the bill. Add this to the wretched situation of the agrarian economy, of peasants and cultivators, and we can see in hindsight that economic discontent was real and indeed felt by many. There were also political grievances that had been building up. First, there was the symbolism of alien rule. Company rule and reform after the 1820s brought visibly modernizing effects. British law courts, government offices, the telegraph, railways, and of course, British commerce. There were also a spat of rapid annexations from the late 1830s, which started to unsettle many regions the British had not yet touched. Due to the fiscal debts the company was constantly trying to recover, the period between the 1833's loss of trading monopoly and the 1856 annexation of Awadh was really a Janus-faced one. The liberal improvement of India was also the height of the company's most militant expansionism. It was no irony that the company was the most aggressive when it was fiscally most in the red. Other crucial areas of India were not yet ruled by the company, namely Sindh, Punjab, and Awadh. Now let's start with Sindh. The case of Sindh in Western India was, very honestly, a real cynical piece of imperialism. The company's Governor-General between 1842 and 1844, Lord Ellenborough, goaded the Sindhi leaders, or amirs, into a humiliating treaty in 1843. The treaty stipulated that Sindh and additional northern territory could be permanently annexed if the amirs were proved to have been disloyal. Of course, this was broadly defined. And of course, it was in the company's favor, for they very much knew that the Sindhi amirs would eventually rebel, giving the British the pretext to annex. General Sir Charles James Napier, who was assigned to Sindh, provoked a conflict on these grounds through a creative interpretation of disloyal. In the Battle of Miani, Napier successfully brought about the defeat of the amirs and the prize annexation of the territory, while securing for himself a knighthood and governorship of Sindh in the process. Yet crucially, this annexation gave the company the pretext to conquer the strategic mouth of the Indus River. Sindh was a lifeline for northwest India due to this river system, and the company was so unabashed in its conquest that when Sir Charles Napier took it in 1843, one political cartoon in the London satirical magazine Punch showed Napier kneeling before Queen Victoria saying "Peccavi," which is Latin for "I have sinned." In fact, this punning critique is often misattributed to Napier himself. And here, the company's military efforts and intelligence were crucially bankrolled by the Hindu banker Rothschild families, something we've seen take place in India before. Now let's move to the Punjab. The Punjab was a major strategic consideration. Before British rule, it was ruled by the Sikh-led Khasla, or army, and since the death of its leader, Ranjit Singh, it had started to threaten the British in Delhi. The company's political agents and intelligence officers noted a rising belligerence and pumping up for war among the Akalis, or the self-styled pure and immortal army officers. Some of them called for war against the British as they were getting closer and closer with each passing day. The Punjab was also at the crossroads of India and Central Asia, and played into British strategic thinking about the Great Game with Russia. In the 19th century, British officials were scared by Russia's expansion into Central Asia. Russia started sending spies and launching raids into the famed regions of Samarkand and Bukhara, starting from the 1840s. Since the Punjab was the crossroads between Central Asia and the Indian plains, the British were naturally worried. This fear of the Russian bear led to two wars between the company and Sikh-ruled Punjab between 1845 and 1846, and lastly in 1848 and 1849. Replicating what the British did in other parts of the Indian subcontinent, the company collaborated with disaffected Sikh royals who were in tension with the army. After a series of razor-thin battles in which the British nearly lost, the Sikhs were finally subdued in 1849. And one particular collaborator, Gulab Singh of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, was rewarded for his services with the Kingdom of Kashmir. Singh would rule the Kashmir Valley on behalf of the British through indirect rule. This meant that his male lineage was in charge of a largely Muslim, though religiously moderate population until the partition of India in 1947. Thus, the origins of the current Kashmir conflict between India and Pakistan can be traced back to the company's wars against Sikh-ruled Punjab in the 1840s. Now, why was the conquest of the Punjab so important for the company? Well, there are a number of reasons. For one, some of the finest soldiers in all of India could now be part of the company's army. After the 1850s, Punjabis would constitute the most important regiments in the British Indian Army, or what two famous historians have called the iron fist and the velvet glove of British imperialism. Yet what did all these campaigns importantly do to the company's budget? Well, when you're fighting wars, it drove the company further into the red. These military fiscal campaigns pressured the company to seek out new revenue sources. One way the company did this was through, as we've seen, its economic policies. But crucially, it also rewrote Indian traditions of kingship and customs to do this. The British created something called the Doctrine of Lapse. This stated that Indian kings who could not produce a biological male heir, the company would take over. This breached a long-standing tradition that allowed Hindu kings to adopt and continue their lineage. But the company's fiscal obsessiveness led it to throw this custom completely out the window. The doctrine of lapse informed the company's rapid annexation of a series of smaller kingdoms, such as Satara in 1848, Jhansi in 1853, and Nagpur in 1854. And last and most significantly was the annexation of Awadh in 1856. Awadh's lush agricultural plains had long enticed the British, and the company squeezed as much as they could out of the kingdom without formally annexing it. One Governor-General, Lord Dalhousie, himself a liberal reformer, found a way to pluck away at the state like Awadh without formally annexing it. Dalhousie set a train in motion that was bound for Awadh. He called Awadh, quote, a cherry which will drop into our mouths one day. The British believed that Awadh had around 15 million pounds sterling in annual revenue. So in 1856, the company annexed Awadh on a fairly spurious claim of maladministration that vaguely echoed the doctrine of lapse. This annexation of Awadh in 1856 was the last kerosene-soaked rag thrown onto the pile before Indian Sipahis lit the spark of the eventual uprising in 1857. Awadh's shameless annexation was a real insult to many Indians. Many of the company's best soldiers came from the region. To see their villages and king treated so badly was humiliating. It was also gravely insulting to them. Because remember, Awadh had long provided the company with innumerable recruits and finance through the subsidiary alliance. And now the British were effectively rubbing salt in the wound. So in the last 15 years before the Indian Uprising, over 20 smaller and larger kingdoms were quickly parceled off through the doctrine of lapse, and their revenues were appropriated by the company. Its contradictions aside, the company was now known as the Angrezi Sarkar, or the English Authority. Now, let's move to the actual events of the uprising in 1857. It got started in Barakpur in March of 1857, just before the summer heat of Hindustan arrived. Mangal Pandey of the 34th Native Infantry ran amok one evening high off bhang, marijuana mixed with milk. He tried to raise a religious revolt against the British and attacked his British officers. He was arrested and then hanged. After this event, the term Pandey was used by the British to describe any mutineer or rebel. Yet the events really took off in Meerut 2 months later, in May. The company had introduced a new Enfield rifle for soldiers sometime in April. Yet there were rumors among the soldiers that their cartridges were greased with swine and cow fat. And further, the ends of the cartridges needed to be bitten off to fire properly, which of course would necessitate oral contact. Now, who would this offend? You got it, both Hindus and Muslims. Even though the cartridges were likely greased with linseed oil and beeswax, it didn't matter. Hindu and Muslim soldiers interpreted this as a confirmation of a clandestine plot to convert India to Christianity, or at least undermine their beliefs. And you can see why it would have made sense, given the steady accumulation of grievances. Many Sipahis refused to load the new cartridges, and many were court-martialed. And on the 10th and 11th of May, the 11th Native Cavalry Regiment mutinied throughout the evening and early morning. They quickly overran their British officers and looted the armory. Tapping into existing resentment, the Sipahis soon overran most of North India with arms. Company authority quickly disappeared across large swaths of North India. The Sipahis and others marched to Delhi and proclaimed the aged Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, as Emperor of Hindustan. In fact, one mutineer told him bluntly, "Old man, we have made you king." Now, why would they rally around the Mughal emperor? Weren't the Mughals more or less out of business? Well, the Mughal emperor was still a symbol of sovereignty and one that could mobilize the masses. The Sipahis and those who joined them absorbed many tracts of rural countryside west of Delhi, and they found support among peasants, cultivators, and displaced weavers, all of whom felt the economic pains associated with British rule. Recently annexed Awadh was in outright revolt. People in cities and villages suddenly found they had something in common. They were joined by zamindars and peasants, and the newly installed British administration of Awadh was gone, like that. And in this insurgency, revolts were led by famous rebels such as Nana Sahib and Tatya Tope, who proved to be a genuine menace for the British in the battlefield. Parts of central India were also in open revolt. Here, they were led by the Rani of Jhansi, whose kingdom had been recently annexed by the company in accordance with the doctrine of lapse. She fought against company troops on horseback herself. Yet the Sipahis and those who joined them didn't move their base beyond Delhi. And by late 1857, this proved fatal to the uprising. The British were able to move troops up the rivers with steamboats and motivate Punjabi soldiers to take revenge upon the very troops who helped the British conquer Punjab in 1849. The Sipahis in Delhi perhaps placed too much faith in Delhi as the center of power. Remember, British power was spread across India and was importantly projected up-country from Calcutta. There's no consistent picture, as we've seen, of who participated in the uprising. But it's clear that many groups joined, particularly in the countryside. The eastern Gangetic regions of Bihar and Awadh saw the most significant cooperation between rural laborers and urban elites in rising up against the British. But what really stood out about the uprising was the agrarian protest. And it shouldn't be surprising, given how brutally the Indian peasantry had been subjected to the company's military fiscalism. In fact, often the first person they attacked was the British tax collector. His revenue demands, after all, were uncompromising and symbolic of British rule. But the uprising and Great Rebellion was also complicated by its limited geographic scope. Bengal, Bombay, Madras, and the Punjab were relatively quiet. Bengal had a large military presence, and English-educated Bengalis looked down upon their northern neighbors as provincial hillbillies. The Punjab was also recently annexed, so it had a large presence of British military officers. And in an ironic fit of revenge, Punjabi soldiers helped quash a rebellion by the very Sipahis who had helped the British conquer the Punjab back in the 1840s. And in the Maratha country of Western India, troops and people were surprisingly loyal and helped suppress the uprising. By late 1857, the British had recaptured major tracts of the Gangetic Plain and Delhi. And the repression was, well, brutal. It was the opposite of modern-day counterinsurgency operations. When cities such as Delhi, Lucknow, Kanpur, and Meerut were recaptured, the British dealt out an object lesson in retribution. Delhi, long a center of Indian Islamic culture, was defaced. Mosques and buildings were leveled. The British went straight into the city's old Muslim section, shooting and arresting anyone who was even remotely suspected of being involved. Even Muslim clerics were not spared. Firebrand Muslim preachers and their supporters were arrested and some shot on sight. In Lucknow, the British practiced what could be called leveling operations. They cleared major neighborhoods and shot at will. After it was recaptured, Indians were actually forced to live in the outskirts of the city, with the inner city reserved for Europeans only. And as a punishment, perhaps most tellingly, the British made Lucknow the most highly taxed city in all of India. At a more general level, the British made an example of those who rebelled. They sometimes wrapped Muslim rebels in pigskin, forced alcohol down their throats, and hanged them. To Indian Muslims, they were as much physical as they were religious insults. Other suspected rebels were tied to cannons and then blown to smithereens, with their innards and blood splattered across the ground. In the Kaiser Bagh area of Lucknow, what remained was telling: flattened structures, rubble, and bones strewn across courtyards. Not even religious buildings or mosques were spared. They became symbolic targets of retribution. Numerous mosques in Delhi and across North India were leveled. Some, like the 17th century Jama Masjid, or Friday Mosque, built by the great emperor Shah Jahan, were turned into military barracks by the British, where soldiers smoked, drank whiskey, and ate their bacon rashers. And to top it all off, the British arrested the Mughal emperor. Only a few years ago, the British would have shown respect and granted the emperor dignity in the Persian language. But Bahadur Shah Zafar was a reluctant emperor and was nearly 80 years old at the time. When the British marched in, they manhandled him and simply told him he was under arrest. The British pensioned him off and exiled him to the Burmese port city of Rangoon under British surveillance. The last symbol of an older era was now gone. Let's now move to understanding the impact of the uprising and Great Rebellion. It's fair to say that 1857 was neither a national revolt nor simply an isolated military mutiny. It was both a patriotic uprising and a regionally specific movement, which quickly petered out. It contained elements of a somewhat proto-nationalism, but not enough to carry the whole of India. One effect of the uprising was that the British began to question in reverse the liberal reformist impulse that had dominated since the 1820s. The idea that meddling in Indian religious and cultural sensitivities for the sake of improving India was now gone. It had caused too much trouble. And this ushered in a new attitude of caution and conservatism. This did not mean that the British suddenly became nice, sympathetic rulers. They remained self-convinced of their right to rule India. But the racial edge now stood out. They felt more convinced than ever about their own superiority. Tales of supposed Indian barbarity, such as the slaughter of women and children, fed the expanding balloon of British imperial hubris for the next 100 years. And as we will later see, it exacerbated notions of Indian racial inferiority, made the British more racist, and shaped how the British administered India as late as the 1940s. There were also crucial military changes after the uprising. Since the army, which was really the final guarantor of British rule in India, had rebelled, significant changes were made. All the high caste recruits from the Gangetic Plain were no longer deemed trustworthy. And in their place, Punjabis and Nepalese Gorkhas became a larger part of the army. The British increasingly saw the simple soldiers of Nepal's mountains and Punjab's plains as more trustworthy, manly, and importantly, less likely to rebel. The British also infused India with more European troops. Previously, there had been roughly 3 Indian soldiers to every 1 European, and the British changed this to a 2-to-1 ratio. Upwards of 30,000 extra British troops surged into India. Indians were actually now barred from handling artillery. Plus, the entire countryside was disarmed. The British made arms possession a crime. They confiscated nearly 3.5 million guns by 1858. And the law for possession of armaments was harsh. Hoarders were slapped with either a 500 rupee fine, 100 lashes, or 7 years imprisonment. Needless to say, there was no Indian equivalent to the National Rifle Association at this time. Now, did you notice something about the date of the uprising? You got it. It was 100 years after the Battle of Plassey. A coincidence or a plot? Some of the British thought it was a Muslim plot to throw them out of India. Indian Muslims, after all, had lost their political power to the British. By the 1850s, the British had effectively appropriated the world's grandest and wealthiest Muslim empire in history. This theory, though, largely reflected what we would call British Islamophobia. Of course, Indian Muslims did have substantial grievances, but their actual participation in the uprising was patchy, fragmented, and uncoordinated. There also was no call for jihad or holy war against the British. Unlike today's radical Islamists, few Indian Muslims took to arms for religious reasons in these heightened years. Even Indian Muslim clerics couldn't agree among themselves. Sunni clerics weren't exactly excited about the restoration of the Shia Muslim dynasty in Awadh. Clerics couldn't agree whether to declare jihad against the British or their Indian collaborators, many of whom were Muslim, like the Punjabi Muslims who actually helped quash the uprising. And the events of 1857 and 1858 also changed Britain's constitutional relationship with India. In 1858, the East India Company was abolished through the Government of India Act. This was the end, formally, of company rule and the contradiction of the sovereign merchant-sovereign paradigm. It cost nearly 50 million pounds sterling to suppress the uprising. And it was not so much that it bankrupted the company, but more than that, the contradiction of company rule nearly threatened British interests in India. So the ambiguity of a trading company exercising political powers was finally over. The company was replaced with crown rule, India was now a proper colony of Britain. This began the latter period that became known as the British Raj, or rule of India, and would last until 1947. After 1858, the British forsake any further expansion. They forswore any further territorial annexations, and, surprisingly, they kept their word up until they left nearly 90 years later. Okay, so we've covered a great deal in this lecture. A lot of economic history, all of it crucial. Let's stop for a moment to recap and see what we've discussed. We've looked at how grievances accumulated in India against the company and how the company's voracious fiscal appetite often fueled this resentment. We then examined the outbreak, scope, and progress of the uprising. We saw how the experience of the rebellion changed the way Britain governed India and how it halted this era of liberal reform. The events of 1857 and 1858 should be seen as an almost inevitable outcome of the changes that the company's economic interests changed in India. Peasants starved. Weavers lost their livelihoods and incomes. Both Hindus and Muslims felt their religions and customs were under attack. And as a result of these changes, the era of company rule was over. So this was a major constitutional change in India's history. But the events of the mid-19th century also profoundly affected attitudes towards India, its cultures, people, and traditions. To be blunt, the British became far more racist, conservative, and reactionary. While the fact that they became more sensitive, not to upset India's religious and cultural feelings, might have seemed nice, it also emphasized the differences between Britain and India. And it was a difference that the British increasingly believed boiled down to race, which gave Britain the right to rule India. Under the Raj, as we will see, the British became colder and more aloof in their dealings with Indians. And this reflected the way the Raj governed India up until the 1940s. It was a more conservative, reactionary, and denigrating ethos that would have made Robert Clive's generation terribly uneasy.